I'm going to dive in now into a little more about the sort of basics and the way Blender works, talk a little bit about adding models, moving, rotating, scaling them, also a little more information about things like the viewport properties, things like overlays, the rendering types, and also a little bit about this bottom right panel over there. So adding in meshes, you'll notice that there are some little menus sort of up at the top there. We've got a little add menu right there, and you'll see that there are various primitives under meshes. There's all kinds of other things like curves and lights and cameras and stuff all in this add menu. I personally like to use Shift A. Wherever my cursor is, I'll get a little pop-up that's just exactly the same menu, and that way I can create things like cubes this way. So Shift A, add, mesh, cube, and you can see it just pops it in. Now something to be aware of when you first create a primitive here in Blender is that this little thing pops up at the bottom there, and that can be expanded. This is like in Maya when you have created a new primitive and you get that inputs on the bottom right, where you can change things like the initial size, scale, things like that. The difference here is you can't add in subdivisions like in Maya, but there is sort of a way to do that after the fact, which I will show at one point. So one thing that you can do here, which I find handy at times, is you'll notice, by the way, by default you are generating UVs for your models. You can actually choose to not generate UVs if you want. If you don't want to bother with the default UVs and you plan on doing your own UVs anyway. There's also this nice alignment thing. You may not be able to see this so well in this case of this cube. I'm just going to, by the way, X with an object selected allows you to delete something. I think you can also just use the delete key on the keyboard if you prefer. I'm going to create instead a cylinder. Shift A, add mesh cylinder. Now I'm going to go to the front view here. Remember, you can hit the tilde key, go to the front view, and you'll see there's the front of the cylinder, but I still have that initialization panel set up. This, by the way, is where you can change, actually I was saying that you can't change subdivisions. What you can't change is the subdivisions on a cube, but you can change certainly the axis subdivisions. They just call it vertices right here. You'll see, for instance, I can change this to 16, and you can see now I have a cylinder with fewer sides, or 64, now I have more sides. So you can change that stuff at this stage. I'm going to go to, say, 36. I also wanted to mention that with this panel up, let's say I go to the front view here. Down here we have a line world. I can click on that and go to view. And you'll notice basically what it'll do is it'll just take whatever the view is and it will align it sort of the height of the cylinder. So for instance, if I turn my view and then click on align view, see how it actually allows us to look straight on at the top. I mean, it ultimately gives it a strange angle in the world space, but you may find that's handy. I'm going to actually go back to the top view and change that back to view, and now you can see it's just oriented correctly upright. Now in addition, I may have mentioned this earlier, but over here in this little drop down you'll see there's a thing called overlays. This is where you can do, for instance, show and hide the grid or the grid floor. You can also turn on a wireframe unshaded right here. And the reason I'm doing this now is so that you can see this little thing over here. You'll see cap fill type n-gon. You'll notice there are n-gons at the top and the bottom of the cylinder. If you want, you can change that to something like a triangle fan, and that's basically the kind of top and bottom caps that you're used to from Maya, where you can see those kinds of things there. You may notice, by the way, this is a little bit of a tricky thing with Blender. The moment you click off your mesh, you lose that panel. So you need to make sure to change those settings the way you want them to begin with. You could also select your model, X, delete, Shift A, create a new mesh cylinder, and this time it actually keeps all the old settings that we just changed before. So that is one kind of workaround over there. All right, So I'm just going to get rid of that now. Let's go back to add mesh. Actually, I'll switch it over to why not a cone. And again, the vertices if you want to. Change the base fill type, and gone. You can also change this to nothing. You can see it just ends up with a hollow object. It's kind of nice at times. I'm going to switch this back to N-Gon. And let's take a look at moving, rotating, and scaling your model. Now there's a couple of ways to do this in Blender. The first way, which you might like, is pretty familiar to other programs. You can see over here on the left, you got tools for move, rotate, scale. And you'll see that the doohickeys, the gizmos, are pretty similar to other programs. You can see now I can just grab the arrow here, I can grab right in the middle, and I can just sort of free rotate or move this thing. I think I mentioned this again in the last video as well, but I'm going to open up my side panel, the right side panel over here with the N key. And what this is nice for is now I can see basically the transform properties over here. So if I move this around, you can see all those locations or translations are visible over there. You've got this doohickey that allows me to move just in 2 axes at a time. I can move to a different view over here and say move just along the y-axis. Remember the depth in this case. I can switch over to rotate, and hopefully all these things are going to be pretty familiar to you. Scale. You can scale this stuff. It's a little tricky to get the. There we go. I got the 3 scale parts now, but I can just scale just in one axis using one of the cubes. Okay. Now that's one option. I actually typically don't use those. There are a few uses I find for those. I typically use hotkeys for this kind of a thing. And this is something I haven't seen, at least precisely this way, in another 3D program, but I quite like it. And the hotkeys are, let's start with moving. Blender actually calls this grabbing, and by default, the hotkeys are often the first letter of the thing you're trying to do. So if I'm trying to grab this, I'll just hit G. And I just let go of the G. And the way this works is, now when I just move my cursor around, I'm not pressing anything at this point. It's sort of temporarily stuck in this grab mode where I can just move this around, and then when I like it, I just place it with my left click. Okay? I'm going to undo that. Now if I want to rotate this with the hotkey, it's probably what you might guess, R for rotate. And again, I'm not clicking on anything, I'm just dragging my mouse, and you may notice, by the way, it's not rotating along any of the axes, it's rotating in relation to the viewport. Okay? So you may not like that. I'll get to how to control these in a moment, but last but not least, scale. S for scale. Again, it's sort of a temporarily stuck kind of tool where I just drag my mouse left to right basically, and it just scales this evenly. Left click to have it stay. Okay, so what if I wanted to add more control to this? Blender allows you to kind of stack hotkeys. Like you can hit one and then the next one to start to control things. For instance, let's say I want to move this around or grab it along the x-axis. First I'll hit G. Now I'm sort of entered into that grab mode. Then I'm going to hit X. And you'll notice we get that little highlight along the x-axis. That's telling me that now when I move my cursor left to right, it's only moving it along the x-axis. And again, left click, it places it. So if I do now G, Y, it's just moving along that axis. G, Z, up and down. Okay? And you'll see a similar thing with rotate. So if I start to rotate, Y, now you can see it's rotating. So again, what I'm doing is I'm hitting R first, then for instance X, and now you can see rotating around just the x-axis. And finally scale. So I hit the S for the scale. Then I'm going to, in this case, hit Z to minimize, constrain it just to the Z-axis. And now when I drag, it's sort of a tricky one, not that tricky, left to right, you can see I'm just scaling along the Z-axis. And then again, left click, that has it stick or take. And each time I'm just doing an undo just to go back again. Now, how can we add in even more control? Let's talk about snapping. You'll notice there's a little magnet up at the top here. It's off by default. I can turn it on permanently by just pressing that button down. There's a little drop down just to the right of it, which tells you what kind of snapping you're talking about. By default, it's set to what's called increment snap. This is just a grid snap. The other kind that you'll often find yourself using is a vertex snap. Okay. Now, I tend to like to not turn this on, but just leave that off and just use the hotkey that sort of temporarily enables the snap. That's the control key. So if I start to, I know it's a lot of hotkeys, but first I'm going to hold down, I'm going to press rather, G. Remember, now I'm starting to grab or move this. Now I'm going to constrain it to just the x-axis, so I just hit the X key. And then finally, I'm simply going to hold down, and this time I need to hold it down, the control key. And when I left click, sorry, not left click, when I just move my cursor left to right, you'll notice it is grabbing it. It's only moving it along the x-axis. And since I'm holding down control while I just drag my cursor, it's snapping it along the grid. And you can see, sure enough, my location X is a perfect one. So again, I was sort of not describing it well, so I'm going to describe it again. This time I'll do it maybe in the y-axis. So I just hit G, but I don't hold it down. Now I'm in the grab mode. This time I'm just going to hit Y, but I don't have to hold it down. Now I can grab along the y-axis, but then finally I need to hold down control. I'm not clicking on anything, I'm just moving my cursor. And now you can see I'm moving it or grabbing along the y-axis. The control is what allows it to temporarily snap. And then I just let go of everything with a left click. It places it. Okay? So you have a similar kind of thing with rotate, for instance, where if I go to R, this time I went to the front view just to make this a little clearer. Then I'm going to hit Y, so it's just rotating around the y-axis. And now you can see it's a free rotate, but when I hold down control, you'll notice it's starting to snap in. Not sure what the increments are. Well, I think it's 5-degree increments. You can see over on the right there. In the rotate Y, that is just rotating in 5-degree increments. Okay, so the control kind of does double duty for different kinds of snapping. Finally, let's try it with scaling. S, let go. This time I don't think I'm going to bother with any constraint. I'm just going to scale the whole thing up or down. So you can see I can just drag my cursor to make it larger or smaller. But if I hold down again control, you'll notice scaling up in 10-degree increments. Or sorry, not 10% increments. So I can create a perfectly double-sized cone that way. Okay? So again, control is a way of temporarily enabling your snapping. Quite nice. Now you may like to use these other tools over here. They're perhaps a little more intuitive, at least to start, but trust me that once you get used to those hotkeys, it is a really nice way to work. Alright, what else can we do over here that would be handy? I think I talked about collections already. Just to remind you, I can go up to say scene collection. I want to add in a new collection. It's kind of like a container for a lot of meshes. Right click, go to new. You can see there's a new collection too. I can double click on this, rename it, say head. Oops. Hit the caps lock. There we go. And then I can say take my cone, and how do I get it in there? The way I like to do it is with another hotkey, M, for move. So with the cone selected, if I hit M and just let go of the M, a little pop-up happens. You can see it says move to collection. There's the initial or default collection called collection. I haven't renamed it. And then there's that new one I just created called head. If I just left click on the head, you'll see now it's placed the cone inside there. I can, for instance, collapse that. I can show or hide that entire layer. I can show or hide the objects in that layer. I'm not sure if this is on by default in Blender, but this is a little feature I've enabled in Blender where you'll notice right above at the top of this scene collection, this scene view, there's this little drop down right here, filter. And you'll see there are different sort of things you can do to just filter your different collections and objects in different ways. And I believe this is off by default, but this is a selection filter. So you'll notice I like to have this on all the time. Let me just show you what it looks like when it's off. You'll notice In this case, all I have are the eyeballs, so that all I can do is show or hide individual objects. But if I turn that on, now I can say I make it not selectable. So you can see no matter how hard I try, I can't select that object until I make it selectable again over here. Okay? Other useful stuff while I'm thinking of it. Let's talk about vertex snap, actually. So while I'm thinking of it, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this model. Shift D. And you'll notice when I just Shift D and let go of Shift D, it creates a duplicate. I'm not clicking on anything. I simply have another cone. I'm just moving my cursor around. It's just going to place it in some random spot. If I want to control this a little bit, if I hold down Control, sure enough, it applies that same snapping again. So I can say snap it and place it maybe a couple of units over to the right there, a few units over to the right. So I was talking about this other kind of mostly useful, of the most useful snaps. The other one that you're probably familiar with is the vertex snap. In this case, I'm going to go over here to this snap drop down, change to the next option, vertex. Now, when I G and let go, I'm grabbing. If I hold down Control now, you'll notice it's not snapping to the grid, but if I pull it over here, it's sort of doing a funny thing in this case, but you'll notice it is starting to do the vertex snap based off of the other object. It can be a little bit weird to control, at least at the object level, but it works a lot better when you're talking about like vertices and faces and stuff like that. I'm not sure if this is a default. I believe it is. You can also, if you want to have a hotkey for this little thing, I'm often finding myself switching between vertex snapping and grid snapping. Control Tab. Is that right? Doesn't want to work. Never mind. We'll just use that for now. All right. Again, X allows you to delete objects. So I'm going to stop that video for now and move on to something for another video.